So let's talk through every single faction in Warhammer 40k, which miniatures are considered the worst looking models for each of them, and why. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're doing a big faction roundup and talking through some of Games Workshop's less loved miniatures that they have currently on sale. Games Workshop's got an enormous Warhammer 40k model range, most factions having huge amount of miniatures, though there are certainly some that are a bit more famed to either divide opinions or just look outright bad, at least compared with each other. For this one I thought I'd try and apply a little bit of data to it, and I basically ran an enormous channel poll asking you guys to rate the looks of a whole bunch of likely candidates, plus giving people options to suggest more, and then basically asked you to rank each miniature for looks. So this is the result of around about 1,000 hobbyists ranking what they like and dislike. Obviously I'd take this with a pinch of salt. Looks of miniatures are absolutely about the most subjective thing that you can have, and it is kind of notable that even the majority of ones that were pretty low rated, most of them still have a good proportion of people who still absolutely love the miniatures. I thought it would be interesting to see what actually ranked the lowest though for each army out there, including the ones that are generally regarded as having pretty nice miniature sculpts. So for each faction in the game I'll round up a bunch of the near contenders that also ranks low, and then focus on the miniature that was voted the single lowest. Starting out, we've got the Space Marines. I feel like with their enormous range they had quite a lot of options that people suggested, both lesser loved things from the Primaris range, some of which had some pretty weird decisions made when they released them, but also on the other hand really quite a lot of more aging firstborn models that maybe don't look great put side by side with the upscale Primaris Marines now. For ones that were a bit lower, the Outriders had a 53% approval, maybe slightly basic Primaris spikes there, not a lot of options and some mould line issues. The Centurions had the same. Generally really quite badly received miniatures when they first came out, and generated a lot of memes, but people seem to have warmed up to them a bit, maybe embracing the slightly stompy and squat aesthetic that 40K's got a bit of a reputation for. And it is kind of crazy to me to see them actually outranking the standard tactical marines. It seems that now with the vast majority of the range being Primaris, people actually rated those lower than the Centurions. Kind of interesting, as I'm just absolutely certain that that would not have been the case prior to the Primaris Space Marines coming out. There's also the Storm Talon gunship down here. That one voted 47%, and Space Marine flyers never really been particularly renowned for their good looks, or the aerodynamics of some flying bricks potentially. The Storm Talon with its fairly tiny cockpit and plane I've seen likened to a flying smart car before, and then the Invictus Tactical Warsuit seems to be lower than those, the stripped back Redemptor chassis with a Space Marine pilot in it, maybe a bit of a curious one and a very Primaris one. Then the runner-up for the Space Marines was far below any of these though, most of those sort of like mid-ranking, some people like, some people dislike, but the Invader ATV notably below that. You guys voted that with just a 33%, fairly well renowned to be one of Games Workshop's less popular resculpts, maybe trying to update the attack bike and not doing the best job of it, definitely having some Mario Kart style buggy vibes, weirdly under-armoured on the front of it for some reason and up-armoured on the back, plus the guy who's driving it must be getting a bit of a headache with that Gatling gun literally right next to his face, and the model itself maybe isn't the best kit in the world, perhaps a little bit simplistic compared with its rivals. For the Space Marine things though, there could only be one winner, and that's the Primaris Desolation Squad. They were given a 28% approval rating by you guys, only narrowly beating out the Invader ATV, but no real surprises to see them rated as the lowest. It's maybe kind of surprising that Games Workshop managed to get Primaris Space Marines with missile launchers quite so wrong when it feels like it should have been at least a fairly easy job to do. These guys just have some very curious design choices, basically having a belt-fed but weirdly small missile launcher in that Castellan launcher, where if you just had that gun all by itself it would look curiously tiny, but then maybe to bulk it out a bit they've got the big t-shirt cannon style things on the top, sort of trying to be individual hunter-killer missiles on those super frags or super cracks. And then with the sort of lore that they want to do in-game, the idea is that the Castellan launcher fires indirect and the super cracks fire direct, so it kind of implies that the guns might want to be pointing in two different directions at once, and the whole missile launcher on a missile launcher thing just looks far more in common with what the Orks might come up with as opposed to the Space Marines. I've certainly seen people do conversions to try and fix them in one way or the other, though if they do wind up being the only thing to replace Devastators it'll be a bit sad. Fingers crossed we might actually get a Primaris Devastator squad as well in a similar sort of way to how they did the Sternguard veterans. I guess we'll wait and see though. For the forces of the Astra Militarum, again there were a fair few to choose from. I put Lord Solar in the poll, but he was rated a little higher. Maybe not objectively such a bad miniature, even if he does have some criticism for not fitting in quite so well with the aesthetic of the army. For the near misses for Guard, there's the current sculpt of the Commissar. It maybe isn't abysmal, but just feels a bit of a downgrade on all the other sculpts for Commissars that they've had over the years. Just not particularly dynamic or exciting or menacing. Ursula Creed scored 51%. Lore-wise she felt like she had some big boots to fill, and there's certainly been a few people comparing her to a lunch lady. The Taurox and Taurox Prime were particularly not enjoyed when they first came out. I feel like there aren't really quite so many vehicle models voted super low here. The decision to put this on 2 different separate tracks was a curious one. I've seen a lot of people convert one or more of the track units to a different one, and the side-mounted autocannon guns also look a little bit on the weird side without much flexibility of where to shoot. The runner-up, it seems, was the current Primaris Psychosculpt. This was the one that was originally from Blackstone Fortress and replaced this sort of old man guy who was the Metal or Finecast model that came before. I feel like she's perhaps just got a bit too many Genestealer Cult vibes going on with that big bald head and sort of psychic headdress style thing, and maybe has a bit less of a military vibe than the previous one. For the Guard though, there could only be one winner, and the Kaschan Jungle Fighter models have been ones that have been in desperate need of an update for about as long as they've existed, really. The kit hails from all the way back in 1999 and feels like it was from several previous ages worth of plastic kits, and definitely has the older school heroic style scaling going on. Absolutely ridiculously enormous biceps and hands and things. I guess definitely conveying the vibe of them from a distance, but at the expense of the model's looks if you actually pick one up and take a look at them. The details just aren't particularly amazing either. I feel like the wide-eyed paint job of the guy at the front probably doesn't really help them out with their reputation for model looks. It is just kind of crazy that they've lasted quite this many years without an update as well, particularly given the sheer amount of releases that the Astra Militarum have had in recent years. What's kind of frustrating as well for Kaschan players is that they have actually released some individual miniatures for Kaschan Jungle Fighters, such as this Colonel and the Sergeant one, both of which were really quite well liked and well done. I strongly suspect they will be redoing the Kaschan range at some point, maybe in 11th edition if the Guard are lucky perhaps, and they also feel like they could be a particularly good kit for a Kill Team release if they wanted to. Not hard to see why they were voted super low though. By your numbers, these ones were second lowest ranked in all of 40k. For the Adeptus Mechanicus, the vast majority of their range is at least fairly well regarded. Pretty nice and recent plastic sculpts for the warriors of the Machine God, though maybe with a few more than some that just push the boundaries of weirdness a little bit with all the crazy tech that they've got going. For example, some people like the Da Vinci winged Tabaxi much more than others. For the closer runners up though, not everyone seems to be a fan of the hovercraft style Scorpius Disintegrator and Dune Rider. That one was voted at 56%. To be honest, I really quite like the fun idea of the landing craft of the Dune Rider for me. I think I prefer that of the two compared with the Disintegrator. And then I was wondering whether the Sidonian Skatros might wind up being ranked lowest, but it seems to be standing tall just above that level. You guys gave the Stilt Boy a 53% approval rating, and I did suspect that when I looked at the breakdown of the voting, there'd be an unusual amount of people either voting him ranked lowest or ranked highest. Most of them have a more sort of smooth curve with being ranked somewhat midish by a lot of people, but it's definitely a miniature that people either seem to just love or hate. In any case, it seems that for the Admech it was the Electro Priest that were voted in lowest. They do maybe look a little bit more out of place compared with some in the Admech army. For a faction that's all about replacing the flesh with the machine, it's a little bit odd to have bare-chested priests here, even if it might make sense with their lore making their bodies living conduits to the motive force and everything like that. I feel like their miniatures on the tabletop maybe require a bit of imagination as well. I guess the idea would be that these Corpuscari are just blazing out with lightning bolts all over all of those things that cover their hands and heads, but you don't really have that modelled, so they're sort of holding up some rings and things. Even these weren't voted super low though, 46% isn't all that bad, not compared with Space Marines and Guard for example. Before we move on, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Tabletop Stronghold. They're makers of magnetic carry cases to get your miniatures from A to B. The idea with magnetic storage systems being that you attach magnets to the bottom of your miniature's bases, so they get held in place in magnetic sheets as they go from A to B, and that means that you can rank up really quite a lot of miniatures in one tight space, as you can see here. There's plenty of ways that you can do magnetic transport, plenty of people DIY their own. The Tabletop Stronghold solution are these mag cases, a more custom crafted thing designed for miniature transport. The boxes are made of notably sturdy MDF, really quite hard to break and can bear a lot of weight. Then they've got a bunch of trays that can slot in at different levels, depending on the height of the miniatures that you're storing. The miniatures get attached to those sheets, and then there's a clear acrylic sheet that clips on the front, so they can be fully enclosed while also being able to see what's where, and also display your handiwork of course. Broadly speaking, I've generally heard positive things about them, both down in the YouTube comments and on Reddit reviews and things like that. The vast majority of people who've picked one up have tended to enjoy it. In any case, I'll leave them links down in the video description below. They've currently got a sale on for 25% off, and I'll cycle back to them at the end of the video if you'd like to hear a bit more about them. In any case, thanks to them for sponsoring this one. Next up, we've got the Imperial Knights, an army without really all that many kits at all, and the kits they do have are generally well liked, doing their job pretty well. The three primary classes are the Armigers, Questores and Dominus, none of them really being particularly hugely lower compared with each other. It seems that the Preceptor was voted as the lowest ranked Questores class knight, though not really by all that much. From the core codex, the single lowest voted thing were the Armiger Helverins. They're still broadly overall very popular miniatures at 67% approval ratings. Seems there's no major complaints from these guys. I'd guess they probably got voted least, as they might just be a little bit less exciting as knights that charge into close combat, plus these are the sort of squire guys doing the grunt work as opposed to big centerpiece models. I could maybe see if some people weren't super convinced by their guns for hands sort of aesthetic thing as well. In any case though, not really meaningfully worse than any of the rest of the knight range, and broadly pretty popular models. For Imperial and Chaos Knights, it looks like the Forge World Knights might actually be the ones that people consider not competing great with the Codex ones. It looks like the Armiger Moirax, the Questor Styrix, and the Great Big Acastus Asterius model, they're all placed in a little bit lower once again, though broadly more people liking them than disliking. Sticking with the Knights, and next up we've got some Grey Knights. Certainly with their impending Codex and miniature release coming out, there's some sense they could just do with a range refresh in general. Maybe a slightly frustrating sort of part of their release cycle where generally people know that it's coming. They're probably going to get some Primaris scale miniatures at some point, though it seems that's 11th edition rather than 10th. The Brotherhood Terminators maybe don't score too low, they're on 54%. The Venerable Dreadnought is on 45. I guess not really technically a Grey Knight model though, which might not help, as well as having the scale proportions where the other Primaris Dreadnoughts are towering over it. The Storm Talon scored 40% again, though it's not really a Grey Knights model, and for the most part I've tried to keep miniatures that are actually faction specific as the main ones for this ranking. Otherwise you're basically just ranking things that weren't really designed for the army in the first place, and they're just sort of add-ons that you can have as support gear. It seems that the standard strike squad has been fallen out of love a fair bit. Kind of interesting that one, as it does sort of hail from the slightly newer era of Games Workshop plastics, where their ability to make plastic miniatures got a fair bit better before they released these guys. They do have lots of options, and I feel like they look fairly iconic, but I guess maybe just not holding up to current sort of Primaris scaling Space Marine designs that Games Workshop have been coming out with. They were voted on 45% approval, the same as the Dreadnoughts. Again for the Grey Knights though, a really obvious winner. The Grey Knights Nemesis Dread Knight was voted all the way down at 30%. It's not generally a model that people had any great love for when it first came out, main criticism tending to be the placement of the Terminator on the Dread Knight, the idea being that he's piloting it and then his limbs are having the Dread Knight be an extension of his own might, but he also looks just a little bit on the cute side, just slung up there, and people do like to compare it to a baby carrier. I did think with it being kind of notably unpopular as a model kit, it was kind of surprising that Games Workshop decided to double down on it with an upgrade sprue kit for it to be able to make it into a Grandmaster Dread Knight. I just can't help but think it's probably a model that Games Workshop would do better if they had a second go at it and maybe redesigned it with some slightly different aesthetics. I don't know if that seems a bit less likely now they've released an upgrade sprue for the same model though. For the Sisters of Battle, in general they're a super recent and really quite well liked model range, despite having really quite a good number of units. There aren't really too many things that seem to be standing out as ranks low or not very popular. The Arco-Flagellants are maybe not one of their single most popular kits. The Ecclesiarchy Zealot type thing is maybe having a very different aesthetic to the rest of the army. I feel like they're not the main reason that people get into playing Sisters of Battle. And out of their character sculpts, perhaps the single worst received one was the Dogmata. Maybe feeling like she's got a little bit less of an inspired pose for a character style miniature. A fairly straightforward model for a character that you pay lots of money for, plus not one of Games Workshop's better face sculpts, though she does have a helmeted option. It seems that just nosing below for the Dogmata though was the Ministorum Priest. This one's the Thaddeus the Purifier style one from Blackstone Fortress. There's two available, and the one with the Zealot's Vindictor was rated far higher. He was dropped down at 46% though. Again, perhaps feels a little bit less in keeping with the rest of the faction. Though again, compared with some of the factions out there, I wouldn't say that it is particularly standout bad. Next up, we've got the Adeptus Custodes. The vast majority of the Custodes range is relatively recently, and I'd say pretty well done. Big chunky guys and all very finely detailed Auramite armour. They're not really a huge amount of different kits to talk about from their mainline Codex range. For the ones that were voted a little bit lower, the Venerable Contemptor Dreadnought got 58%. Technically that's not really a very Custodes focused kit, it's more of a Heresy era one these days. It was kind of weird that the Venerable Contemptor Dreadnought from core Codex Custodes survived, given that they don't have a 40k model on sale for it anymore. Though otherwise below that, the Pallas Gravitac was rated a little bit on the low side as well. A bit of a curious low slung vehicle with a single bolt carbine. I guess somewhere between a jet bike and land speeder, though not really fitting in amazingly with the rest of the army, at least in my opinion. And then out of Valerian and Alea, Valerian specifically was voted at 48%. Most of the model being fine enough, though I feel like they really didn't do his face sculpt much favours. It just feels like it looks a little bit weirdly big for his body, and again isn't exactly one of the best facial sculpts that Games Workshop have done. For the winner/loser for the Custodes though, it's the 10th edition release, the solo release Shield Captain. He was voted down at 47% approval, so just very slightly nosing out Valerian there. a Custodian captain where they basically arranged the model to make him appear absolutely as wide as possible. His stance doesn't really help with it, quite a wide apart leg stance with his forward foot on a tactical rock. The cape makes him chunkier at the back, the shield at the side, and the Guardian Spear held out that way as well also adds to the whole effect. I'm not sure that the little helmet plume at the top of him does anything to lessen the effect as well, and the overall one had a lot of people saying, is this a Custodes release or is it a Leagues of Votann release? I guess the helmet plume playing into that as well. I feel like on top of that though, it's maybe not done any favours by this particular choice of promo shot. I feel like it looks a bit better if not looking directly on at him or not from a modellised view. Even just slightly rotated like this one that I found on Reddit with a quick Google looks quite significantly better. Still though certainly not the most popular miniature, even if he has a bit more to make him distinctive versus the ones that you build out of the Warden or Guard box sets. Next up, we've got the Imperial Agents, and for them I've not really bothered with second place runners up here just as there's such quite an obvious winner. Inquisitor Cody has this new model as being perhaps the worst received model in recent 40k history, going from an older though fairly imposing and kind of well light miniature to one that almost feels a little bit impressive as to how many ways they managed to go wrong with it. Firstly, the power armor is just weirdly big and chunky and less ornate and interesting compared with the previous miniature. Perhaps particularly around the legs more so than everything else. It feels like he's got Space Marine legs but a normal human body. I've seen people talk about him as if he's Wallace and Gromit with the wrong trousers or having a bit of a diaper effect going on. The hammer pose is a bit of a weird one. I feel like they were trying to make him look a bit more imposing, but it just looks a touch odd as to what he's trying to do there. Almost looks like he's having a bit of a conversation with someone. His feet feel like they're in kind of weird positions on his tactical rock as well. He's not exactly striking a heroic stance, but sort of standing on a raised outcrop still. The older hammer pose was a bit more imposing. The realisation of his face and hair don't really help him out. The front of his armour's got the most enormous belt buckle in the world going over it, and while the Cyber Eagle I think is quite cool to see it taking flight, they've also been trying to do the recent Games Workshop thing where they avoid any needs for flying bases, and it just makes it a really weird model to read and almost looks like it's crashing headlong into a bit of terrain, as opposed to majestically soaring through the air or something. Overall, not too surprised to see this one just absolutely bombed by everyone in the reviews. It has been voted as the single worst miniature out of this entire list, with an approval rate of 15. Finally for the Imperium, let's talk through the Divergent Space Marine chapters. For the Blood Angels, they really felt like they drew the short straw with their recent range release. Both the Black Templars, Space Wolves and Dark Angels have all been better received than theirs. Most of their character miniatures not really too well disliked, the Sanguinor maybe being the one that drew the most consternation. Fairly similar in style, though I've seen people take issue both with his head and his armour sculpt, and the Bile Predator is maybe a slightly older firstborn kit. They're still well enough liked for both of those, with approval of 60% as voted. This one was always going to be a two-horse race, and the first of them are the Primaris sort of not Death Company, one of the two iconic units of the Codex, and these guys basically didn't even really get a kit, literally just being represented by either jump intercessors or regular assault intercessors on foot, and then you've literally just got one Inferno pistol and one Eviscerator to represent the unit's upgrade with. Everything else is done with paint transfers and imagination. My personal guess is that this is probably a halfway house and eventually we will get an actual Death Company kit, but until then they're basically taken a quite themed and flexible kit and just replaced it with standard intercessors. Just about beating those though are the Sanguinary Guard, which have to be one of the single worst received Primaris updates out of any of them, and this one coming after really quite a lot of hope and hype for when the firstborn models would eventually get a redo. I feel like the firstborn ones had a good concept, but still maybe not particularly well executed, so it was maybe a bit surprising when Games Workshop took them away and they came back actually worse in most people's eyes. Maybe the biggest sad thing was that they decided to get rid of the wings on the jump packs, which was really quite an iconic feature of them. It really made them feel like avenging angels swooping down from the skies. Maybe a little bit overly fancy but not out of keeping for the Blood Angels, and now basically have wing symbols on these sort of flap things for the jump packs. The armour was also made a bit more simplistic as well. A lot of people weren't particular fans of either the helmeted Deathmask style heads, looking a bit too overly Stormcast Eternal maybe. 3 in a box for a similar sort of price tag maybe didn't help, and the addition of a war gear swap was nice, but ultimately didn't really seem to make up for the overall look of the model. I will say myself, I feel like the models are significantly improved by the addition of some third-party winged jump packs and a head swap. I've used the Greytide Studio winged jump packs on mine. I definitely prefer the overall look and feel of the model after. I'll leave those linked down in the video description if you wanted. There's a link both for the US and the rest of the world. But certainly feels like a fail of a model if quite so many people have gone out to try and find alternatives for various bits of the model to try and make them fit their purposes. Next up we've got the Space Wolves. They've had their big and really quite well liked big range refresh recently. Pretty well all their new kits were rated pretty well by people when I did polling about them at the time. It does leave the ones that are more likely to be criticised as the remaining firstborn ones that weren't updated. For a couple of them that people rated a bit more mid, there's the Thunderwolf Cavalry, I guess not looking quite as sharp as their new Primaris cousins. They definitely have some fun factor, even if it might have been jumping the shark just a little bit to have Space Wolves riding giant wolves, and Murderfang was ranked around the same sort of level, voted 48% by you guys. Again, the firstborn Dreadnoughts being a bit more short in stature versus the newer Primaris ones. That's maybe a bit of a peculiar look, having the Wolfen style head bursting out of him. Talking of Wolfen though, for the actual lowest voted miniature, there was nothing else close. You guys rated Wolfen top 10 worst miniatures in the game, with a 31% approval rating. These guys definitely were ambitious models, trying to bravely blend both Norse elements, the armoured look of Space Marines and their gear, plus 4.5 devolved werewolves all into one single miniature. I feel like almost whatever look they go for, it's probably going to be a bit of a curious mix. Though even then seems likely that Games Workshop might have a better job if they had another go at these guys. I feel like there's just a few things that look a bit off with them. Maybe their elongated legs with their great big paws on the feet, but then the majority of the rest of their body maybe looking more man than wolf. Feels a bit on the peculiar side. The half-devolved heads maybe look a bit on the weird side as well, perhaps particularly the guy leading the pack here. And to me, they've always felt just a little bit uncanny valley, but not in a particularly great way. I'm not saying their appearance might not broadly make sense for their lore though, and even if they're generally considered not to be Games Workshop's best miniatures, plenty of Space Wolves collectors still really enjoy them. They definitely have a different sort of vibe to their prior ones, which were a lot more close to just standard Battle Brothers and power armour. Devolved Wolfman bits sort of poking through as opposed to bursting right out of their armour plates and things like the Wolfen now. I feel like having the backpacks on the Wolfen, but not really having full power armour to go with that is a bit of a curious choice as well potentially. Next up, we've got the Deathwatch, and they're basically an army without all that many options in the first place. People generally rated the look of the Corvus Black Star quite highly, the Watchmaster and the Deathwatch veterans being broadly positive, but maybe not a standout so. I sort of feel like that's maybe again the firstborn Primaris thing, even if both kits are really quite nice ones in my opinion. The model that was voted lowest for them wasn't really done so by all that much, and that's Deathwatch Captain Artemis. Kind of basically the same sort of level as the Deathwatch veterans here, so it doesn't sound like anyone's too disappointed with him. Probably just somewhere between firstborn miniatures in general, feeling like they're on the way out. I wouldn't say he's the single most exciting sculpt that Games Workshop's ever made for a unique character, but at the same time he's not the blandest either. He's got a good sense of motion to him. For the Dark Angels, everything that got redone was really quite well received for them. Like the Space Wolves, none of their more recently updated miniatures feature on this list. There's really quite a lot of stuff that's sort of around about the 50% approval mark people are a bit borderline on. Samael's here being an older fine cast miniature on his jet bike Corvex. I feel like he'll be really interesting to see an updated version of. The Black Knights is one of the very last holdouts of firstborn bikes here as well. The Landspeeder Darkshroud with its curious sort of flying shrine thing is here on 48%. And then to be honest, I was probably expecting Ezekiel to be voted in last, given that he's an absolutely ancient miniature at this point. He's dating before the entire modern era of firstborn sculpts, let alone Primaris, and he's still a very rare miniature that's made for 40k in metal at the moment. At the same time, I feel like he's got a pretty cool looking classic sculpt, and absolutely definitely wasn't a bad one for his time. Voted lowest for the Dark Angels though was the Landspeeder Vengeance. This one was given a 42% by you. It seems the fun factor of having enormous dual plasma cannons can't quite save it. I'm not sure why this one was rated significantly lower than the Dark Shroud. Maybe the fun factor of the sort of flying shrine reliquary was something that people quite enjoyed, with their icons of old Caliban obscuring the machinations of the Unforgiven. I feel like for me maybe one of the most off-feeling things about this one is the front gunner with a pintle-mounted bolter or assault cannon. I guess it goes with more classic Landspeeders having the single driver and single gunner. Having that big blocky circular thing on a Landspeeder that otherwise looks at least somewhat aerodynamic just feels like a bit of an odd one really, and maybe weirdly far forward relative to the craft's centre of gravity. I can't help but think that the model might just look a lot more cohesive if he was either mounted further back in the more normal like co-pilot seats, or if it just wasn't there in the first place and it just had its big guns for this one. Either way probably seems kind of likely for retirement or replacement with some sort of Stormspeeder equivalent in 11th edition. Feels like they basically did half of the Dark Angels range but didn't do the Raven Wing in 10th. For the Black Templars, not really too much negative to say about any of their stuff. They're just not really a faction with any disliked models at the moment. They have had a small range done, and Games Workshop seem to have delivered on their expectations really quite well. All of their nearest closest things had approval ratings over 70%, so far higher than the vast majority of things that we've seen so far. Besides the one voted lowest though, it was the Black Templar Marshal, the new Execrator Chaplain, and the Crusader Squad. I'd guess these ones maybe just feel a bit more standard issue stuff as opposed to big standout centerpiece models like Helbrecht or the Emperor's Champion maybe, but clearly these are in general well liked. The one that was voted the lowest really wasn't done so by much, but at the same time it doesn't really surprise me. This one's the Black Templar Castellan that's harking back to the 3rd edition rulebook cover, and it certainly felt like a bit more of an appeal to nostalgia style model, being fairly faithful to copy the exact design from the older artwork, even if it's really quite a different aesthetic to the rest of the Templar range in their more modern looking Primaris armour. It feels like the sort of model that plenty of people absolutely love, but maybe there'll be a good chunk of people who don't really like the retro thing quite so much and are a bit more mid on. He's still ranked high though at 67%. Moving on to the Forces of Chaos next, and first we have the Chaos Marines themselves. Chaos Space Marine were ones that had some fairly fierce competition for worst voted miniature, and even the two main runners-up are voted significantly worse than the worst picks of a whole bunch of other factions out there. We've got the Defiler that was voted on 37%, which I think is just showing its age really. It's quite an old and venerable plastic kit at this point, maybe not quite so nicely realised as things like the more modern Venom Crawler. And then also ranked down here are the Chaos Spawn. They were on 32%. I feel like Games Workshop made compromises to make these kits just ridiculously flexible with all manner of different mutations that you can plug in all over them. It does mean that you can have any two look really quite different, but maybe as a bit of a trade-off against the overall looks of the model. The one at the front certainly looks a lot more goofy than intimidating. Just slightly ahead of these two though are the Chaos Bikers. These ones are getting towards being some of the oldest models in 40k at the moment. They're miniatures all the way back from 1999, I believe, and again are another case of basically a model that hasn't been updated throughout the more modern Firstborn era, and then somehow the Chaos Bikers managed to get passed over in the entire era of Chaos Space Marines getting big updates in 8th and 9th edition, when it did seem like such an obvious choice they could do, maybe particularly after Games Workshop released the Outriders for the Primaris. I feel like they were kind of fine enough miniatures for their day, but they are basically completely monoposed, have old style bolters that don't even necessarily look too much like the more modern variants, and the detail just doesn't really hold up towards their more contemporary Chaos Marine brothers. There was a previous really big rumour that predicted a whole bunch of Chaos Space Marine releases in 9th edition. It featured a bunch of things that hadn't been released yet, things like the Accursed Cultists, and it featured Chaos Bikes, but then we didn't actually get any release for the Chaos Bikes. That does make me think that it's probably a kit that Games Workshop has actually already resculpted. They just seem to have held the kit back for a future release. Maybe it could be a minor release wave for the Chaos Marines with these guys for 11th edition or something, unless they decide to be more generous to the forces of the Dark Gods. In any case, you guys rated them super low. I think these ones were voted 3rd lowest in 40k. For the Deity Legions, I thought we'd go for their unique miniatures as opposed to talking about all of their generic Chaos Space Marine stuff. I feel like in reality the generic sculpts would almost certainly win, given that they just weren't really made for these armies and more supposed to be for standard Chaos Space Marines, so just detract from the theme a bit as opposed to add for it for these guys. For the Death Guard, most of their range is pretty well enough received. Two of the slightly lower ones that were voted were the Miasmic Malignifier fortification, maybe not really too much exciting about it as a little plague chimney, though I feel like it's pretty nicely done faction-specific terrain as they go. Out of the Death Guard characters, the Malignant Plague Caster has been one that people aren't necessarily the biggest fans of the sculpt, perhaps at least partly because of having a slightly weird looking face. I've certainly seen a fair few people preferring the sculpt that came out of the Death Guard Kill Team set. Just ranked very slightly behind the Miasmic Malignifier though is Lord Felthius, and to be honest he'd probably be the miniature that I'd choose for the Death Guard by quite a margin. It's basically the current sculpt for the Lord of Contagion, and it's the only one on sale from Games Workshop now, as they never released the Dark Imperium one separately. A few of the Death Guard's more recent releases just feel a little bit on the cartoony side. They weren't afraid to be a bit over the top with the guts and the flies and the nurglings and things. And for the most part I feel like that's a positive and adds to the fun factor. I feel like for him though it's maybe not realised in the best way, and maybe the paint job doesn't do him huge amounts of favours there. He's certainly going for the very jolly Nurgle approach with that great big grin. I feel like his scythe maybe isn't the best executed at all, the sort of drips coming off at a slightly odd angle, and the root spur things attached to the top of his armour feel a bit on the confusing side. He definitely seems to be a miniature that divides opinion though. Again, maybe like the Sidonian Scatros, he seems to have both people who have voted 5 and voted 1 for it. Lots of people ranking him at the two extremes, either really enjoying the slight over-the-topness of the model or really disliking it. For the Thousand Sons, they don't have tons of unique kits. The ones that were ranked as lowish but not bottom were the Zangors, the Enlightened getting a 62%, the Shaman getting 58%, and the regular Zangors getting a 53%. They also put the Mutalith in the poll for interest, which ranked a fair bit higher at 70%. Seems that people really quite enjoyed the Great Warp Vortex Beast, despite not really being designed for the Thousand Sons, but originally being a port from a more wild monster from Age of Sigmar. In general though, I'm not too surprised to see the Goat Birdmen ranked as lower than the rest. Most people tend to get into the Thousand Sons for the Space Marines and Sorcerers as opposed to the Mutants. Despite all that, they're still not rated all that low though. It seems that being rated just under the Zangors are the new Sekitar robots. Not significantly though, the Sekitars were voted 52 and the Zangors 53. The Sekitars certainly got a bit of a muted reception when Games Workshop did their reveal. There had been a fair bit of hype for Thousand Suns Automata that had been teased a bit already. It did feel like they maybe just weren't quite what people had in mind. Perhaps the main criticisms of the models, the poses just seem to be really quite static. Not really much motion about them at all, though perhaps that's going with the whole statue theme. The models are maybe just a little bit on the hard side to read. They're trying to do three things at once really. Be futuristic Warhammer 40k robots, at the same time as they're trying to be ancient Egyptian statues that you might find in tombs or something. And then also on top of that have some Thousand Suns iconography. So perhaps quite a lot to communicate while still being cohesive. I have a feeling that the paint job hasn't really done them any favours as well. Games Workshop decides to go for a sort of faux stone style look. Maybe again trying to mimic those statues, but perhaps having them look a little bit out of place relative to the rest of the Thousand Suns as a result. Even having said all that though, they're certainly not terribly received, definitely more mid as opposed to outright bad, and plenty of people still rated them high and outright like the look of them. I maybe wouldn't be too surprised if they wind up being a miniature that people get used to a bit and maybe get a bit more popular over time. Judgment of looks in 40k certainly isn't too static, maybe it's best demonstrated by the Space Marine Centurions out of this list. Next up we've got the World Eaters, again a pretty recent range as they go and a fairly nicely executed one. None of their unique models really feel stand out bad to me to any stretch of the imagination. There were quite a few that wound up being ranked kind of similarly. The Cultists maybe don't surprise me too much to be on the lower rank of things. Again, I'd imagine most people think about collecting World Eaters for the Space Marines more so than their Cultist hangers-on. Even the Jackals are kind of fun models in their own right with the big chain blades and their blood tanks. Kind of interesting that people don't really seem to rank the 8-bound much higher though. People not quite as convinced by the World Eater's possessed equivalent versus the regular Khorne Berserkers or characters I suppose. Only slightly lower than these was the 10th edition release of the new Slaughterbound, the slightly bigger 8-bound who's possessed by a Bloodthirster with the chain blade for an arm. Again, reaction to him was maybe a touch on the underwhelming side, partly due to people hoping for another wave full of World Eaters rather than just one character model. Well, I feel like he's not exactly a bad miniature as characters go. He does maybe strike me as just a slightly bigger 8-bound that otherwise looks like an 8-bound kit bash. I just didn't really feel like he added a whole ton in terms of appearance wise. Still though, more people enjoy his looks than dislike, I guess. For the Emperor's Children, again they've got a fairly tiny range worth of model kits, and their stuff was also really notably well received. The second lowest out of their small range being the Flawless Blades, who I guess have a bit more weirdness going on with their sort of elongated skulls, though I feel like some of their other head swaps are a bit better here. They also have the slightly peculiar Slaneshi half chest thing going on, which is a bit strange to see on Space Marines. Still though, broadly very popular and adequately messed up for servants of Slanesh, I guess, and technically voted worst were the Tormentors and Infractors, who are both on a very appropriate 69% for the Emperor's Children. Well done to the internet for managing to make that the Emperor's Children number. I don't feel like there's anything really all that wrong with them though. It's more a case of just the basic troops being a bit less exciting than the elites and centerpieces of the army. Maybe particularly notable for the Emperor's Children, given just how many of their kits were very, very well received. For the Chaos Knights, if we look at just their unique models and not the stuff that they borrow for the Imperials, they only have the two kits. They don't really seem to have a worse model, given that both of those are really quite well liked kits, the nice flexible Abhorrent chassis kit and the War Dog one. The worst variants voted for both of those were the Night Brigand and the Night Ruinator, though these were basically on almost the exact same ranking as most of the rest of the variants, so it's not like they're notably worse or anything like that. And I guess that means that if we're talking about unique miniatures, then the Chaos Knights technically get the best worst miniature of Warhammer 40k by these ratings at least. It was the Abominant Knight that was voted the best in faction. Otherwise, if you include the Imperial Knight ports and the Forge World models, then you could mark it as other things as the worst. The Huntsmen and Executioners were voted at 71%. I guess if I'd differentiated between the two, it probably would have been the Helverin style Executioners that would have been the worst. And then including things out of the Codex, as with the Imperials, it's the Wardog Moirax and the Styrex, seemingly a bit lesser loved compared with the core Imperial Knight kits. Finally, for the Legions of Chaos, we've got the Chaos Demons, and they're an army that's got really quite a lot of aging kits, some of which could do with refreshes. For the lowest four, all of these were noticed as kind of notably bad compared with some of the other ones in 40k, all of them below 50%. The Flamers are on 45%, who I think have a really cool idea, just maybe not the best execution of them. I've painted up some of those myself, and it just feels like the teeth, bodies, and flames all sort of blend into each other a bit. Maybe all very Zinch, but not necessarily the best for looking at. The Pink Horrors are on 43%. Quite a few people prefer the previous old metal sculpts of those, and they changed the aesthetic a fair bit there. I feel like the previous ones were warped, but in really quite a good way. The Demonettes weren't really a particularly well received kit when they came out, maybe trying to emphasise the demon side of them as opposed to being in any way alluring or anything like that. Again, I've certainly seen plenty of people say they prefer the slightly more risque versions that came out before them in metal. And then one of the older ones that was the next most competitor to the lowest voted was the Seeker Chariot, voted down at 40%. The one that was voted lowest for the Demons, though, was the Soul Grinder. This one was voted at 36%, and this one's really quite an old Games Workshop plastic kit at this point, from when the Demons were first made to be their own independent thing of other factions out there. I've definitely seen people saying online that they just find them a bit goofy looking, and it's got quite a different aesthetic to the rest of the Demons range, sort of having the Chaos Space Marine style Defiler legs grafted onto a Demon, which might make sense, I guess, if Vastor is making these somehow in his forges. They might not be the best for helping it gel with the rest of the faction. It was also released for Sigmar and 40K as well, so I sort of feel if they were trying to slightly hedge their bets and not make it inapplicable to either setting. To me, it's generally felt like it's had more in common with 40K settings than Fantasy though, just given the look of the technology. In any case, looks like people would be happy enough to see an update for this one. I've seen some pretty cool themed conversions built around them though. Moving on to the Xenos next, and first up we have the Aeldari. Over the last couple of editions, they've had the vast majority of their older kits updated, one after the other, and given that they also had a few sad losses that are no longer on sale, I feel like despite having really quite a big range as a faction, the vast majority of it holds up really quite well despite being some very dated models at this point. Things like the Viper and Falcon and Wave Serpent faring maybe a lot better than certain other kits from around about their era. For some of the lower ones though, there was the Night Spinner, I guess a grav tank that's an artillery tank. Maybe feels like it's going at a little bit cross purposes to some extent, a bit less exciting or dynamic than some of them. The Dire Avengers do feel like they've got miniatures that could have been updated at some point with the new shiny Aspect Warrior style. I don't think they look bad when they're put together, but certainly the quality of the model kit isn't quite what some of the rest of them are with a bunch of mould lines and things. Maybe that was one factor in them being rated low, and then the Viper itself still isn't hated, but one of the older kits in the range by quite a long way. For the Eldar though, the single lowest rated thing were the support weapons. They had an approval of 45%. I don't know if that's partly due to it being Aeldari doing a sort of fundamentally not so very Aeldari thing, crewing great big heavy weapons with big guns, and I guess the sort of advanced technology grav plating thing that they have them to move around make them feel like a bit more of an unusually shaped miniature for how you might expect a crude gun emplacement to look. The picture base for them feels really quite small for the model as well. For the Darkkin, there was a bit of variance between whether or not we look at the models that are currently on sale, as they have got a fair few holes in their range, models that still have rules but no longer have the actual miniature up for sale from GW. From their currently on sale models, it looks like the two lowest voted were the Archon, with the weird sort of cross pose with his blade and pistol held across his chest. I feel like literally if he was in a different sort of pose to that, then he probably wouldn't be being rated down here. And otherwise it seems like the Hellions on their flying bases just don't have quite as good an overall feel compared with some of them out there. Maybe not aging quite as well as some of the rest of the Drukhari range, which I think for the most part has held out very well indeed. If we did include the units that are in their codex but no longer have models on sale, these would be the things that win though. The Grotesque was rated down at 40%, and the Beastmaster and Beast Packs down at 35%. I feel like for most of these, the individual models were sort of mid-ish, but just not really fit for purpose as plastic kits, being fairly hideously expensive fine cast that you need a whole bunch of different sets of just to make one literal unit, as opposed to coming in the amount that you'd need. I guess they probably weren't selling as a result, so Games Workshop decided to take them down. Hopefully at some point they actually get around to updating them in style. For the Tyranids, again it feels after their massive model update, the vast majority of miniatures that you'd really criticise were replaced by shiny new ones over the course of 10th edition. I feel like they definitely would have had a whole load more contest for the lowest spot before that. As it is, it seems like there's two main ones that vie for the lowest spot. First, the Tyrannocyte or Sporicist one, the kind of Tyrannid fleshy drop pod spore type thing. Maybe a bit of a weird look either way, with a great big fleshy pod that hovers around the board, and the Sporicist not having so much interest, basically being a Tyranid living weapon that just fires out guns in all directions. Technically the Sporicist was the lowest rated, though it feels also a little bit unfair to have the sort of token multi-build version of the Tyrannocyte marked as the lowest thing. The other one that's rivaling for them and is in between the two are the Gargoyles. Again, I'd say they're probably not really stand out terribly bad for older models. They were a kit that were released in 2008. They certainly feel like they have a bit of comparing badly to the new ones though, with newly resculpted Termagants and Hormagaunts. These guys just aren't quite as detailed and have their rather awkward flying bases that can make them a pain to go around the battlefield. I still quite like the aesthetic of them, though I do suspect that if they did decide to redo them at some stage, they will probably look better than they do now. You guys rated them at a 45%. For the Genestealer Cults, they've got an entirely modern range, so it's not exactly sculpt quality that's going to be the worst thing for them. I put a fair few options up, and it seems that it was the more support characters that seemed to get the less interest. They do have a fairly crazy, enormous cast of them, and quite a few of them feel like maybe very slightly inexciting add-ons compared with the rest of the army. The three runners-up for this one were the Mages, the Nexos being strategy guy looking at his planning board, and then the Clamavus, the sort of Genestealer Cult DJ man, supposedly rousing some rabble with that great big audio staff of his. The one that was voted the lowest, though, was the release for 10th edition, the Benefactors, still overall slightly more positive than not at 55%, and this one's the slightly unusual big-brained version of a zone threat mix between a human or near enough, laying enemy tanks and vehicles waste with warp lances of psychic energy, with the big exposed brain thing being quite so ridiculously proportioned with the rest of the body. Again, I'd say it's one of the ones that toes the line between putting the look off or just looking a bit on the silly side, and again maybe one of the ones where there's going to be people who both really like the model or dislike it. Next up, we've got the Leaguers of Votann, once again a new and pretty well executed range, very slightly generic sci-fi aesthetics, space dwarves with some funny shaped Imperial technology, void armour and moonbuggy style vehicles. Most of their models are really quite well enjoyed, the Hecaton Land Fortress and the Hearthkin Warriors a bit lower than some of the rest, the Hernkin Pioneers being a tiny bit below them at 64%, but still broadly very positive. I think there's at least some people out there that might have enjoyed the trikes being done with more sort of normal tired ones as opposed to the hover thing that they've got going. The ones that were voted lower, though, were a bit more clear compared with the rest, with the Chthonian Berserks. People rated them down at 55%. They do feel a bit more out there, and more of a subset of the faction, as opposed to being more mainstream for the Leaguers of Votann, having a lot of bearskin and cybernetics and things. I've seen some compare them to small Ogrins. Again, not exactly super unpopular, though. There's plenty of people enjoying their angry dwarves with great big plasma axes or hammers. The Necrons had their enormous and well-received range refresh in 9th edition. Pretty well all the models that came out there were rather popular. They do seem to have a few clear rivals for worst voted miniature though. The Toonblades were voted kind of low. The idea being that they're really oddly shaped jet bikes just due to being operated by unknowable technology. It does make them a bit ungainly looking and unbalanced though. Trazyn the Infinite feels like a model that desperately needs a resculpt for such a great character of his status. The regular Locust Destroyers were voted down at 43%, the last holdout of the classic Gauss green rods here. It was maybe a little bit surprising when they didn't get an update to go alongside the Locust Heavy Destroyers. It seems that it's the non-Void Dragon Catan that take the top spots though, again being old models and now so much less in stature compared with the new and really well done Void Dragon. For those guys, the Nightbringer was voted on 38%, though the Deceiver was ranked significantly lower at 31%. I feel like the Nightbringer's maybe got a little bit more cool factor going for it, being the literal spectre of death hovering across the board with that great big scythe. The Deceiver maybe not being quite so intimidating, wrapped up in the sort of material style thing and pointing at people. And his head does seem to have a bit of a banana theme going on. I suspect people knowing that he's a fine cast resin model probably doesn't help with the overall vibe of the model currently, and there's the anticipation of what they might look like if Games Workshop redoes them Void Dragon style. If they can manage to pull off quite a success as much as that miniature, I'm sure people will really enjoy them. In any case though, he certainly makes the top 10 in terms of lowest voted miniatures on the list. For the Orks, and with the expectation that they might get a big release for 11th edition, I think there's some sense that there's a bunch of their kits that came out around about the 5th edition sort of mark that Games Workshop might be able to make look better with another update. Voted in the sort of runner-up sort of category are 4 of those. There's the Warbikers, the Burner Boys, and their Looter counterpart builds, being a little bit less impressive in stature compared with their more contemporary boys, and the Pain Boy with his rather curious oversized medical claw. To be honest, I've kind of enjoyed the zaniness of that model, though I can see why some wouldn't like. Voted lowest for the Orks though was the Weird Boy. Again, maybe a theme here with fine cast models not being enjoyed quite so much. I think that he's the last remaining holdout in the Ork range that isn't in plastic now. His character model does feel like maybe a little bit of an overwrought one, really quite a busy model with loads going on. The grot being pulled away by him and making a face while he's grasping that angulated chain maybe adds a bit of fun factor, though I'm not sure he necessarily improves the whole model. I have seen some people choose to assemble without. Feels like it's one that if they manage to do a plastic update that preserve the same sort of theme and style of the guy, they'll probably do a bit better now. I feel like he has to be towards the top of the list for Ork characters to release with a new release for the Orks. Seems unlikely they get another major release wave and not do a Weird Boy. Finally, that brings us to the Tau Empire, and for their runner-up models, there's the Firesight Marksman, yet another holdout of fine cast resin. I feel like the general idea of them is nice enough. They're not exactly one of the big Tau centerpiece models that most people get excited about, and their Razor Shark and Sun Shark bombers were never particularly well loved. I guess they tried to do them in a similar sort of style to the Hammerhead and Skyray, the bar things that they have along the side of them. Feel like they're a bit unusual to see on an aircraft though. It's maybe a bit surprising they went for something like this when they could have done something similar to the Tiger Shark or Barracuda, both of which I think were liked a fair bit more. The lowest voted ones for the Tau though were the Tide Wall fortifications. If anything, I found that a bit of a surprise. I guess maybe being ranked down here as they're just more of a backdrop kind of model than a standard focal miniature for a faction. I'm not sure if I should have discounted them and given it to the Firesight team instead. As it goes, it feels better that these ones exist as opposed to don't as some faction-specific terrain. I don't know if people might be not on board so much with the whole hover aspect of it, but overall it feels like an asset to the faction to keep some Tau-specific terrain around for those that want it. With the Xenos talked about though, that just about brings us to the end of this one. And just to round up, here's a list of the miniatures that were ranked lowest by you guys in Warhammer 40k overall. Chaos Space Marines seem to have done particularly badly on this one, managing to take 3 places with the Defiler, Chaos Spawn and the Chaos Bikers. Space Marines get 2 entries with the Invader ATV and the Desolation Squad. Blood Angels both have their Sanguinary Guard and their upgrades through Death Company. And alongside those we've got the Soul Grinder, the Catan Shard, the Deceiver, the Wolfen and the Nemesis Dread Knight. Taking the top 2 spots though are the Kaschan Jungle Fighters, some of 40k's oldest models, and I feel like one they could really do nicely as a kill team or a guard release wave, and then Inquisitor Kotias of course. It is interesting to see just how much of this list is a good blend of really old stuff, sort of middle-aged stuff, and really new stuff. In any case though, let me know your thoughts. Which miniatures would you rate as the best or worst of Warhammer 40k? Let me know down in the comments below. Finally, just to round off with this one, I'll just cycle back to the video sponsor in Tabletop Stronghold. As mentioned earlier, they're one option for easy to store and transport magnetic carry cases, and are currently on sale at the moment for 25% off. Here's a rough idea of the capacity of each one of those trays on the levels. You can fit around about 90 25mm bases, or around 6 armigers or 30 Terminators or so, and they can be arranged in cases of different heights. The smallest one is this Mag Case Mini, the price £66, $75 or €85. That price includes shipping, though it's not including anything like VAT or import duties. Even the mini one's got a fair bit of capacity though, plenty of Terminators and some big tanks that you can fit in there. The more standard sized one is this regular mag case. This one's £105 or $120 while on sale. This one's way taller, as you can see by the Chaos Knights taking up residence in the ground floor of it. All the cases come with a whole bunch of magnets included, and I'll leave the internal and external dimensions here on the screen. Finally, there's the really big one, basically 2 of the previous attached together. Probably more than enough transport capacity for all manner of stuff. They do have options where you can get more or fewer of the magnetic trays in there as well, depending on your needs for the army. In any case though, check them out, links down in the video description if you'd like to take a look over their stuff. The sale's on for just a few more days, and a big thank you to them for sponsoring the video. I'll leave that one there for now though. Let me know your thoughts on some of the best and worst miniatures of Warhammer 40k. I look forward to reading your comments as always. If you've been enjoying the videos on the channel, then feel free to check out the channel's Patreon page. That one's linked down in the video description below. Channel patrons get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link's down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.